Okay, so let's take a quick look at the presidents. It's an important piece to know. I'm going to be basically going off this. It's done by the History Channel. It's called The Presidents, the Lives, and Legacies of the 43 Leaders of the United States. So it's in 3 discs. You might be able to pick it up. I got it from the library. It was just a nice review. All told, this is 6 hours. I'm going to try to do this in about 10 to 15 minutes. So we're going to be looking at the end of World War I from Truman, end of World War II from Truman up till the second Bush president. Okay, so let's do it. Harry Truman takes office in 1945, and he's in office for till 1953. He's a Democrat. Takes office at the age of 60. Now, FDR had served 4 terms. He was the only president before him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 4 terms. No one else had done that before. And Harry Truman was with him through 3 of those terms. So it wasn't like he was new to government. He had been around, but people didn't really know who he was. He was a guy from Missouri. He was a failed haberdasher, which means he just sold men's clothing. But he was honest. He was down to earth, and he had common sense. So they have the surrender. Obviously, he's very well known for dropping the 2 atomic bombs, and the Japanese surrender at what's called the Potsdam Treaty. Now, Truman really understood that there was a large hypocrisy that was going on. If, America is going to fight in World War II over, say, the ideology of racism, the Aryan supremacy thing, the Jews and all that, and then at home have this black-white segregation thing going on in the United States. So he signs the end of segregation, and he does a huge civil rights program. The inflation was high, and there were elections, of course, in '48. He wasn't very popular. There was labor strikes. The economy wasn't doing well, but his challenger gave only 16 public speeches versus Truman's 100. And so actually, by that, Truman is able to win the re-election. Unfortunately, he sees the Chinese, who had been seen as kind of an ally, become, communists. There was even some people that they felt betrayed, and the documentary talks about that. But basically, the containment strategy did not work, Truman had to admit it, that this wasn't working. McCarthy, who was this guy that was doing all this stuff, like tapping phones and trying to sniff out every communist working in the U.S. government. He was on this witch hunt. McCarthy attacked Truman for being soft on communism. Well, 6 months later, the North Koreans invade South Korea. And China, of course, they backs the North Koreans, communists looking out for other communists. It says it quickly becomes a stalemate. So Ho Chi Minh, now we go over to Vietnam, right? We have that thing going on in North Korea. Now going over to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the North Vietnamese, the communist North Vietnamese, is trying to throw off the French colonialism. And he calls Truman, he asks for his help. He says, Truman, will you help us out? But ironically, so do the French. The French also call him and say, hey, we need your help as well. Well, Truman has a decision to make. Who is he going to help? His popularity is very low, but he decides that he's going to support the French in order to fight communism. No one likes him. He has a 23% approval rating at this point. And eventually, people did come to appreciate him over time, but really he's known as the guy who dropped 2 atomic bombs. Well, then Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes president, 1953 to 1961. He was from Kansas, and actually both the Democrats and the Republicans really wanted him to be their nominee, but he joins the Republican Party. He was known for his participation in D-Day, and as well as kind of like enjoying his life, being involved in leisure. He was a 5-star general in the Army, and he was a very likable guy. He was confident, he was personable. I like Ike was his motto. But some people really wondered if he was really the one making the decisions in government, or if he was just kind of hanging out, playing golf, doing whatever. He did end the Korean War, so that was good. People like that. He cut defense spending, and he used all the money to start the Federal Highway Act. Now, that was huge. There was no, national highway system. And doing this, people said, was a huge, bump in the economy. It was a great investment. It, helped business and leisure, tourism, things of this nature. But the issues of segregation persisted. You had Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the big Supreme Court trial over segregation in the school systems. He had a heart attack, and he kind of, you can imagine, didn't come back as strong as he was before. He distanced himself really from the segregation issue. There was the creation of the Bank of Vietnam, and there was a lot of aid money that was sent to the South Vietnamese. And he could do that because his economy was strong during his first term. But during his second term, the Soviets launched Sputnik. And basically everyone was like, oh my gosh, the Soviets had beaten America into space. And so the space race began, right? It was the kind of the Cold War being played out through the space race. Who was smarter? Who was better? Who could innovate? Who could solve these problems? Is capitalism better? Is communism better? Which one's going to win? So also in 1959, you see Fidel Castro. He leads communist Cuba, and so this is just 90 miles off the south tip of Key West in Florida. So very, very close. Now you have another country becoming communist. Okay, next, JFK, John F. Kennedy. So he was one of the youngest guys, I think, to ever become president at age 43. So very young guy. He joins the Democratic Party from 1961 to 1963. So like less than 3 years. It says that he was president for exactly 1,000 days. And then he changed the culture of America. He was a magical guy. He had a lot of charisma. He had a beautiful wife, Jackie Onassis. They had 3 children. But he was also a guy that was sick. I mean, he had something called Addison's disease, and he was also known for some of his sexual affairs. Now, he wanted the Bay of Pigs. This was basically a move of like the CIA or the FBI, but it was a kind of a covert, an undercover mission that wasn't well publicized, that no one was supposed to know about, where basically the Americans hired and trained a bunch of Cubans, Cuban nationals, so Cuban citizens, but who were trained and working for the U.S. military to go in and overthrow Castro. It didn't work. I mean, it was a massive failure. And ultimately, JFK, he took full responsibility on record. You have to realize that, mass communication, radio, all that stuff. I mean, people, I think, were able to see that that's what he chose to do. That's how he chose to handle it. Some people thought it was a mistake. Other people said, no, this is a guy we can really trust, And so he also started the Peace Corps. But he said something like this. He said, choosing to do hard things. He said, we choose to go to the moon not because they are easy, but because they are hard. He was pushing the space race still. Everyone was still aware of the Soviet threat, the Cold War. It said that they also had information that Soviets were putting medium-range nuclear weapons in Cuba, and that those weapons could basically strike anywhere in the United States, in the contingent 48, the southern 48 states, not Hawaii, not Alaska, but anywhere else the Soviets could hit with nukes, right? And people knew that these were absolutely devastating. I think at this point they had also, been working on the hydrogen bomb, which was just devastating. So people said that it was very close to a nuclear war. Now, what are you going to do? 90 miles off your southern border. Some people pressed him to do an airstrike against Cuba, but JFK worked out a solution with Nikita Khrushchev, which was Soviet leader. JFK also saw Martin Luther King demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. The water attacks, the dogs, and it was very emotionally moving, right? Because now at this point, video, media, video clips going, being available to everyone on the news and things like this. It was easier to relate to on an emotional level what was going on in different parts of the country. Kennedy approves the assassination of the Southern Vietnamese president, which was, wow, I didn't know that. They opened a new space center in America. The next day, he goes to Dallas and was shot and murdered around noon. So LBJ becomes president. By default, he was smart, he was crass, but he was very cunning. He wasn't a scholar, but he was aware of people on a social level. He had a volatile personality. He didn't like that he was given the presidency due to death, so maybe a little bit insecure. People said that he was into bullying. He was 6'2", he would kind of shout people down, mean mug them, just intimidate them by his physical or his volume. And so other people say that he was intimidated and acted in this way because he didn't have the Ivy League, credentials that some of the people that he worked with did. He didn't have that high education. Maybe he wasn't as smart. But he did start food stamps, National Public Radio, Medicaid, Medicare, the Environmental Protection Agency. He says that he was a civil rights champion and that he was able to cut the number of people living in poverty by 50%. So that's wow. But the bad part was that America could not overcome the Vietnamese resistance. There was the anti-war sentiment that just kept growing. And Truman was very famous for containment, but LBJ, he wasn't, there was a lot of people that died during his presidency. And, he'd hear people make these chants, hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today? And they said that it took a toll on him. He took it very hard. There was the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and there was supposed to be like a ceasefire, but actually the North Vietnamese were very cunning, very tricky, and they launched this massive offensive on the New Year, and so it really took the Americans by surprise. He refuses to seek a second term, People say that he was a failed president, and because he couldn't negotiate the peace in Vietnam. Other people say, that he was forced to be a war president, and he never wanted to be a war president. That's not what he wanted to be about, and he was forced into that situation, a matter of circumstance. Well, he, doesn't run. So who's up next? Nixon. Nixon comes in 1969 and 1974. So you can see, not a complete 2 terms, just 5, maybe 5.5 years. But he spent most of his career trying to become president, his political career. He ran on a secret plan to end the war kind of campaign. He had this inside idea, this great strategy about how to get out of Vietnam. But they say in reality he didn't want to end the war. He told the South Vietnamese to keep the war going, that there was some kind of either political or maybe the war machine, the military-industrial complex, was seeing high revenues, high profits. For whatever reason, I didn't catch it, maybe they didn't say in the video, but basically that he was trying to do side deals or under-the-table deals with the South Vietnamese that, he would they would get certain kickbacks. He would give them certain things if they were able to sustain the war, keep it going, keep dragging it out. Now, they didn't want the Democrats to broker a peace deal because Nixon was a Republican. So maybe he, he didn't want. Yeah, I guess they were probably speaking of during his campaign. He didn't want to see the Democrats be the ones to get credit for bringing peaceful into Vietnam. So they wanted to see their party in Vietnam. They said he kept a record of his enemies, like on a book, and that he was a very secure man. So he actually had like a long list of all the people that he had burned bridges with, that were out to get him, and people thought that was very strange. He was determined to prove himself. He was obsessed with power. Nixon wanted to run the foreign policy, but that was Kissinger's role. He sent the Marines to invade Laos, and he bombs Cambodia, and these events were secret, and no one was supposed to know, but somehow the press found out about it, and so told everybody. When this news got leaked to the press, Nixon was pissed. He was pissed. It goes on to say that they had a triangular strategy with Vietnam. So, how are we going to get out of Vietnam and yet make this work in our favor? The idea was to pit the Russians and the Chinese against each other. So basically get out of Vietnam and then somehow figure out a way to get those two countries either contesting for, there's a lot of raw materials like agricultural materials, a lot of mining and such things in Vietnam that maybe those two countries would be willing to fight each other for. But they eventually signed a peace deal. He meets with the Russians and he also meets with the Chinese. He signs in 1972 a nuclear arms treaty. So de-armament, stopping all the threats of building up these huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And he wins a landslide re-election. Also, the North and the South Vietnamese agree to stop fighting, but apparently secretly, Nixon goes back to the South Vietnamese and he says, look, if they do anything, speaking of the North, if the North does anything to violate this treaty, I'm ready to go back in, And he did other weird things like infiltrating the Black Panthers or infiltrating the student movement. There was obviously like the hippies, there was all these protests, these, people burning their draft cards, draft dodgers and all this stuff. So he was putting these government officials or whatever into these different movements. It also said that he possibly tried to overthrow the Chilean government. So eventually what happens is, we all know about Watergate, where they were trying to do some stuff in order to kind of rig the elections, find out kind of the strategy of the Democrats. Well, everyone finds out. There's 14 months of hearing. Nixon is found guilty of obstruction of justice because he lied, and so he decides to step down as president. He says that he gave his enemies the sword and that they ran him through. So, of course, the Watergate scandal, it's how people always remember him, and then Gerald Ford becomes the new president. Now, Gerald Ford is a Republican. 1974 to 1977, he walks into a White House that's obviously in turmoil. I mean, we just had to kick out the old guy or whatever. No one trusts the government. All these secret missions, all this, wiretap, all this whatever they're doing, people are like, just trust in government is very low. So Ford's job was really that he needed to bring peace and reconciliation. He was spending a lot of times with issues related to Watergate, and people said that it was taking up to maybe 50% of his time. He couldn't do any of the things that he was supposed to be doing as president, right? Managing the economy, social rights. I mean, all these issues. he couldn't do it. And so ultimately he just pardoned him in order to get back to governing, him being Nixon. He gives Nixon a pardon so he can just get out from underneath this whole issue and get back to running the country and moving forward. So the North Vietnamese broke the accord. They invade the South, but Congress would not grant any aid or go back to war. They refused to. They're like, we are done with fighting in Vietnam, with our boys coming home maimed or dead. We just don't want to do it anymore. And so Saigon falls. This is the capital of the South. Saigon falls to the communists, and people thought that America would lose credibility. They're really worried. It's like, how is the world going to see us? Are we going to lose respect, lose faith? And at the time, there was a lot of people that they didn't like that the Americans pulled out. Ford does lose the next election, and they decide to go with an outsider. They want to find a guy, that's not one of these, DC kind of schmoozers or politician types. So they bring in Jimmy Carter. He was only in office for 4 years, so he does one term. He's a Democrat, and he's just a one-term governor. So he just served one term as governor in Georgia. He was, self-proclaimed born-again Christian, and he did position himself as an outsider. They used these campaigns, these songs and stuff that he was like this Southerner. He was an old peanut farmer, and so he wasn't like, these under-the-table type of DC guys. He just, that's not who he was. And I mean, I guess he won on that. Obviously, he won on that. So he decides to walk after his inauguration to the White House. So people thought that he was a humble guy, he was a down-to-earth guy. He had also worked on a nuclear submarine previously, so he was he was previously a military. He was a veteran. He tried to be a Christian, something that didn't always work in DC, is what some of his critics said. That it doesn't work like that. You have to play dirty. You have to do all these deals, give somebody else what they need in order to get what you want. He had the Protestant work ethic. He was associated with micromanaging people. He refused to really get involved in the political games of Washington. He just wouldn't do it. And some people believe that he was too idealistic, too pragmatic in order to really negotiate the powers that be in Washington. And so many people said he was ineffective. He will go down as a president who made civil rights to be kind of the core of foreign policy. So he wanted to help people, be protected, enjoy the same civil rights that we're hoping to see Americans have, or that we ideally thought that we stood for. We want to see that go global. And so one of the things that he's really famous for is that he believed that there could be a peace deal brokered in the Middle East, and a lot of people said, no way. Like, no way, Carter, that's not going to happen. Like, let's be realistic here. That's not going to go down. Well, he has the Camp David Accords, where there was actually an agreement struck between the Egyptian Prime Minister Anwar Sadat and the Prime Minister Menachem Begin from Israel, which a lot of people were like, wow. They were just really surprised that went down. He said it was a great, they say it was a great victory politically in order to broker that kind of peace deal. And that, he ultimately proved himself to be right? He showed his critics that it was possible. A lot of his motivations, they say, came from his religious convictions, Christians and their ties to, peace or global peace or the Jews or whatever. But he thought that it was important to help bring peace, and he wanted, I guess, stand up for the Palestinians. So ultimately, the Camp David Accord started really rocky. Begin and Sadat, they argued straight for the first 3 days. Sadat gets super angry, and he's like, I'm leaving. He's like, I'm done here. And Carter, he blocks the door, and he's like, no, you're not leaving. Well, after 13 days, so 10 more days, they agree on a framework for peace. But months after that, there was the energy crisis. We had a poor economy in the States. His popularity just plummets. And people see Carter as like this moral guy who was in over his head. He didn't know what he was doing. There was, you've seen the pictures of these super long lines at the gas station. No one could get gas. We're buying these like Beetles and Volkswagen Bugs and these super small mini cars, right? Because you can't get gas. There's an energy crisis. So 1979, the other thing that happens is there's 57 American hostages that were taken in the Iranian embassy. And Carter resists the temptation to go to war. People say, man, we got to go in there, But he wants to use diplomacy. And he says that it was the hardest decision of his presidency. He tries to actually use military force at one point. He sends in like a small group and tries to rescue the hostages, but it doesn't work. And so everyone is like, geesh. Well, Carter goes out. He doesn't get reelected. Reagan takes 44 out of the 50 states. So it's pretty much landslide. I mean, people, they've had enough of Carter. They want somebody new. So from 1981 to 1989, Republican Ronald Reagan, the former movie star, serves 8 years, 2 terms. And he was the oldest president at that time. He was a movie star. He was a great leader. He was charismatic, but maybe he wasn't the smartest guy. Said that his wife Nancy Reagan had a lot of influence, but he was the life of the party. Everyone liked him. He was the great communicator, and they talked about that in the days following the Challenger disaster. After the Challenger spacecraft blew up, he had to address America, and he had to be kind of the chief soother, is what they called him. Someone shot him. I didn't know that, but he was shot at one point. He recovered, but he was always the star of the show. But some people saw him as a puppet for that. He had a lax kind of style, and he was maybe a little bit out to lunch. I mean, I don't want to call him like an airhead, but it's like he didn't always seem to know what was going on. He was very just free flow. He wasn't very rigid. Maybe he wasn't very detailed. And so why that's important is because you end up having the Iran-Contra affair, where the Iranians buy a bunch of weapons, and they use that money to fund a Contra uprising. And so this was, people were like, well, Reagan, did you know about this? And he, because he did kind of have this reputation of being a bit aloof, rumored to fall asleep during cabinet meetings, that, he didn't know about it. And I guess, that was part of, is that even believable? And they say, for most people, no, but maybe for Reagan, maybe it was. His economic plan does lead to a boom in the 1980s, but a huge bust in the 90s because there was all this deficit spending. Reagan thought that he could just spend money for whatever he needed. There was domestic prosperity. He cuts the taxes, but Reagan didn't believe that the government should be used for social engineering, like women's issues or whatever. He was credited with the end of the Soviet Union. He does end up going on air and say, tear down that wall. But he also realizes that, he doesn't want to humiliate the Soviets, right? He sees that he can negotiate with Gorbachev, and that this is something that they kind of become friends. They kind of hit it off, and it's really bizarre. But he goes on and he starts this thing, they call it like Star Wars, but it's the Strategic Defense Initiatives, and basically it was dismissed by most as unrealistic. It was this idea that the Earth was going to be surrounded by these satellites that could detect and destroy any nukes that were shot, long-range nukes that were shot, like say from overseas. There was going to be this great satellite infrastructure that was going to be able to protect the United States. Yeah, most people didn't believe it, but apparently the Soviets thought that it could be real, and so that actually affected things. They called it a master stroke politically. He gets out of office. He's replaced by George H.W. Bush, who just runs, he's just in office for 1 term. The famous line, read my lips, no new taxes. And they said that it wasn't really the tax issue that was so important for the American people to hear. It was that we had a decisive person that we were dealing with here. And so that is someone that we can trust and someone who knows what he wants and what he thinks. He went to Yale. He was a competitive guy. He was a World War II airplane pilot. He was actually shot down. And Bush, it says that he liked to govern by consensus. He wanted to get everybody on board, find out what everyone thought, and kind of do it that way, which is weird. It's not exactly the same as the decisive person that we were just talking about. He didn't like slow diplomacy. He wanted to get things done. He wanted to get things going and get things done. He was known for the Gulf War. He made a smart move by not humiliating Khrushchev after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Bush said he wanted to protect people and freedom. But oil and energy, of course, was a huge item. The documentary praised him for getting the endorsement of the Europeans and the Arab nations for the first Gulf War, so that there was consensus, there was international support. Basically, they bombed, aerial assaults, bombs for about 5.5 weeks. And then they sent in the troops. Basically, the Iraqis withdraw from Kuwait, who they had been invading. But they left Saddam in power. They knew that in order to get Saddam out, they were going to have to go full-scale war throughout Iraq. They were going to have to send troops all the way to Baghdad. And they didn't want to do that. It was like too much. They didn't want to go that far. And so they just don't. They just leave him in power. And they say, fine, done and done. Bush eventually does raise taxes, so he goes back on his word, but he said that it was good for the economy at that point, and that as times change, you have to make adjustments, and he was fine with that. We see Clinton come in after him, Clinton is the saxophone governor from Arkansas. He's on MTV. He's very charming. He's seductive. He was a graduate of Yale Law School. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He tries to put through a healthcare bill. It fails, but he does sign NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. Right off the bat, there's a woman named Paula Jones who is accusing him of being in an affair with her for, I think it was 12 years, for a long time. And so she, I guess, brings up some sexual harassment claim at that point. So I don't know the details about that. Basically, he has a booming economy. It's the first time that we see the budget balance since Andrew Jackson, and but he was impeached for the scandal with Monica Lewinsky. Impeached. The Senate doesn't throw him out. He doesn't pass in both houses, and so it was interesting because they say while we were focused so much on Clinton's sex life, really Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, they were really gaining strength, and so. He also did some work to foster peace in Kosovo and also with the Israeli-Palestine issue. So the 2000 elections between Al Gore and George W. Bush, I mean, those were crazy. It was so crazy. It basically came down, you had a tie, and it came down to what was going to happen with the 25 electoral votes in Florida. There was recounts and more recounts, and then they had to look at, I mean, I remember looking at this, there was, are these ballots fair? I mean, does the dot that you're supposed to fill in line up? Because is it with this one or is it with this one down here? If it's not clear, should we throw them out? What about like people who weren't registered or blah, 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 blah. So finally, it goes to the Supreme Court, and it's a 5-4 decision. I mean, as narrow as it could possibly be, and it hands George Bush the presidency. Now, Junior was more conservative than his father, and both the father and the son seemed to see things in black and white, as kind of good guys versus bad guys. Bush was on time. He was prompt. And he does see 9/11 occur during his presidency. He starts the Department of Homeland Security, which will strengthen power in Washington, and he starts the term the axis of evil, because he couldn't get enough support for internationally to invade Iraq. So he goes it alone. They have the shock and awe. They drop all these bombs. I think more bombs than all the bombs that were dropped in World War II, I think, by the Americans. So by the Americans, okay, not all, but by the Americans. There just wasn't a lot of international support. Bush Sr. did not get reelected. Like we said, he only served 1 term, but his son goes ahead and serves 2 terms. So that's kind of how that ends. So I hope that's helpful for you guys. Of course, you're going to have to figure out Obama and Trump on your own, but that's a nice help, especially for some of these early things. And those are really important years, the Vietnam years, the Cold War years, the rebuilding after World War II, some of the just highlights of each of these presidents who are very different, but who all kind of had their, I guess, cross to bear, and who, left a mark on history. Hope that helps. Bye.